Hustings. I'm Jonathan Dowse. I'm one of the consultants from Ipswich Hospital, and I've been asked to be the impartial chair for this evening's event. I'm very grateful to our candidates who have come today to represent their parties. Tonight we've got Sandy Martin, who's representing the Labour Party. We've got Daniel Pratt, who's representing the Green Party, and to my left I've got Adrian Hyyrylainen-Trett, who is representing the Lib Dems. The organisers of today's event have invited the candidates for both the Central Ipswich and the North Ipswich Central Suffolk constituencies, and we're grateful for those candidates who could come today. So during this, what you should find on your seats, a sheet highlighting the manifesto commitments for environmental and climate issues for each of the parties and the current MP's record of voting. Okay, and we're going to use these hustings to find out how our local candidates' views are on the climate and ecological crisis. Specifically, we'd like to see how they feel it should be tackled locally, nationally and internationally, and what they'll do if they're elected to Parliament to try and achieve this. And we'd also like to explore their party's views on climate. Okay. So this is an opportunity for us to ask questions about the climate, and if you've got questions about other issues, please don't raise them today. Okay. The format for the session is going to be a brief introductory speech of a few minutes from each of the candidates, followed by the opportunity for you to ask questions. I'm grateful to those of you who submitted some questions in written form, which we're sort of grouping at the moment, and we'll allow everybody to have an opportunity to speak. The idea is that we'll draw to, we've got until 8:30, so we want to get as many questions in during that time as possible. Okay. It's very important that we conduct this in a honourable way. It's okay to disagree with the views of candidates, but there's no need to be anything other than courteous towards each other. Okay? Be grateful if we don't interrupt what's being said or shout out, and we don't want any bad language today, even in jest. Okay? If you disagree with the candidates, you don't have to vote for them in the election. Okay, right. So we've drawn straws before starting today in order to allow to decide who's going to go first, and Adrian's going to go first with his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the Quaker Meeting House and to have a discussion around the climate emergency. Now, I'm going to be very, very honest and frank with you. There is a climate emergency. It is one of the most important things about this general election. So there is no shadow of a doubt that for me and my party believe that the climate emergency is something that has to be done immediately. And it's at the same level of importance as other issues, which we will try and remain not in the room today, but however those issues actually affect how we deal with the climate emergency. And that is my big worry, that actually the climate emergency gets put to one side because of another issue beginning with B. And until that issue beginning with B is dealt with, we can't deal with the climate emergency at the same time. But as for Liberal Democrats, we've all got our list of proposals. Carbon net zero by 2045, 60 million trees planted per year. We've got a load of ideas in our manifesto which are green, and we have always been one of the greenest parties going forward for many, many years. And even though I would say that perhaps the other two manifestos are more ambitious than ours are costed, and ours are completely understood that these achievable aims that we have in them are possible. And I think sometimes you have to look at what is achievable and what's possible in the time frame that we have. So I look forward to the debate on the issues today and tonight, and many thanks for listening to me.
Yes, what whatever anybody says, the most important issue facing this town and indeed facing the whole country and the whole planet is climate change by miles, and more important than everything else put together. And whatever anyone says, and just in case somebody who's not present, you haven't heard what they've said, they said, this is Tom Hunt, by the way, to be honest, you know, climate change is happening and we need to address it, but I do not believe in massively disrupting people's lives and implementing policies which would be seriously negative for the economy. Our view about climate change is that for anybody who says we can't afford to do this, that or the other, well, actually we can't afford not to do it. Which is why Labour members of Parliament proposed the Environment and Climate Change motion to Parliament on the 1st of May of this year, and I, as part of the Shadow DEFRA team, I was involved with discussions with our Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA, Sue Hayman, and I know that other Shadow teams were involved in the discussions that they had with their Shadow Secretaries of State. We made a really strong case for making it the #1 priority of Parliament, and we passed a motion. NEMCOM, lots of Labour members spoke. I wasn't able to speak because I was part of the Shadow team, so it was our Shadow Secretary of State that was speaking. But I was there for most of the debate, and lots of Labour members spoke, lots of Liberal Democrat members spoke, Caroline Lucas obviously spoke for the Green Party. There was virtually no disagreement amongst the three parties during that debate. Virtually no Conservatives attended at all, and of the ones that did, hardly any of them spoke at all. And when it came to the vote, they bottled out, they dared not vote, because they didn't want to be seen as denying climate change. But they were secretly or privately or to their supporters saying that they thought that it was all a waste of time. And one of the parts, the most important part of the motion was that the Secretary of State should lay before the House within the next 6 months urgent proposals to restore the UK's natural environment and deliver a circular zero-waste economy. The deadline for that, this was passed by Parliament, the deadline for that was the 1st of November, and what did the Conservative government do about it? Absolutely nothing. So I am very much in support of having a bill, because only if you have a bill which is passed in as an act of Parliament can you actually require these things to be done. Doing it as a motion is not going to be effective enough. The trouble with the bill is that it's almost impossible to actually pass a bill into law as an act if you haven't got the support of the government. And in fact, we did have one thing where we actually got the support of the House of Parliament, but the Conservatives just sat on it. This was the constituency redrawing boundary review bill, and they just prevented it from going ahead. It's really difficult to do anything unless you are actually in government. I just want to finish by saying, I've heard people saying, oh, Extinction Rebellion, bunch of nuisances, you know, they're not going to change anything, and so on and so forth. You have already changed things. You have already persuaded Parliament that it has got to act. You have already persuaded the majority of the members of the current Parliament, and hopefully the majority of the members of the forthcoming Parliament, that this is the #1 agenda item, and I am full of admiration for all that you've done. Thank you.
Thank you. Just let me say that tonight I am really thrilled to be here in front of you as your Green Party candidate for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich. Since the turn of this century, we have experienced 18 of the hottest years on record. Our climate is changing. The Green Party has always spoken truth to power when it comes to climate change and the impending biodiversity emergency that we have now. And look at where we are now. Those two things are finally at the top of the agenda, at least for, as it seems, the three parties that are standing here tonight. Our economy is out of control and plunders the earth of its natural resources, creating wealth for a limited few whilst leaving corrosive inequality in its wake. We cannot carry on with business as usual politics. The Green Party has a Green New Deal that aims to lift everybody up by unleashing a revolution that will transform the way that we produce our energy and the way that we use it, the way that we grow our food, the way that we travel, and the way that we work. We will also create hundreds of thousands of truly affordable and truly sustainable new homes. Previous governments have failed to act on climate change, and we don't trust them to act on these important matters right now. Locally, the Ipswich Northern Bypass threatens us with unsustainable development, more traffic, more pollution, and more congestion on our roads. And all of this despite local councils declaring a biodiversity and climate change emergency. Only the Green Party has the plan to tackle the climate emergency in a way that tackles many social matters that are important to us all. And we are the only party that is committed to the ambitious target of becoming a zero-carbon economy by 2030. As a local councillor and teacher, I know that this area needs a real alternative to the politics as usual and a green voice to stand up for what matters to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your introductory remarks. I'm hoping that our tellers at the back who've got questions that people wrote down as they came in are going to be able to give you some questions to start with. Shall we start by asking them? Yeah. We're trying to group together questions so that everybody is made different things. The one that's been given at the top is the chap John Ship here. Do you want to read your question? Yours has made it to the top.
Wow, first question. Hello, I'm John Ship, forestry contractor in Suffolk. A citizens' assembly is in progress on the initiative of a number of cross-party committees. The current plan is to task it with making plans to reach carbon zero by 2050. However, the IPCC warns we only have until 2030 to achieve that. And Extinction Rebellion are demanding a 5-year contingency to bring the target to 2025. Each person here today, are you willing to commit to do all you can to bring this deadline forwards and make its recommendations legally binding? Okay.
Sam, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, fine. Can everyone hear me if I'm sitting down? Sure. Are we?
Yes, fine.
Yeah, we're happy to stay sitting down. So, yes. The answer is yes. The point is, will you do everything you can? And yes, we will. And I think there's an issue about targets, because the further ahead, further into the future you set targets, the easier it is to make excuses for not doing anything. And we actually need to start doing things now, right now, not in 2 years' time, not in 3 years' time, not in 5 years' time. We need to start doing things right now. The Labour Party actually had a big debate about this at conference this year, because there were some people who were saying, well, we need to be realistic about this. But actually, if we don't aim for an earlier date, then the likelihood is that we won't even achieve the later date. But we've got to try to achieve the earlier date. And the date that we set for to try to achieve was 2030. I don't think anything earlier than 2030 sounds realistic. We've got to have something which sounds as if we can actually genuinely aim for it. And so we are going to genuinely aim for zero carbon emissions, zero net carbon emissions by 2030. And in order to achieve that, it's not good enough just to stop emitting carbon. We've also got to put in place those things that will absorb the carbon that's already being emitted. We have got to plant more trees. We've got to prevent from day one the digging of any more peat. We have got to make sure that all those natural systems that absorb carbon from the atmosphere are enhanced, as well as at the same time reducing down to zero the amount of fossil fuels that we're using. It's going to be a massive transformation, and in order to achieve that transformation, we need to put in massive investment in order to change the way that we're doing things, and we are committed to doing that. So as I said, we will aim to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2030, and if we were not to do that, then I don't think there's any chance of achieving it even by 2050.
To both of your questions regarding the bringing forward the dates to 2025 and the Citizens' Assembly, yes to both ideas. We are committed to the date of 2030 because this is the date that we need to achieve net zero carbon or carbon neutrality in order to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change that are associated with a rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that is our target. The idea of bringing it forward to 2025 is a good idea, and that is perhaps something the Green Party could aim for, but we would sort of aim for 2025 or direct ourselves perhaps to 2025 in order to achieve that goal by 2030. So, you know, the party line is 2030 for the target. With regards to the Citizens' Assembly, we are, as the Green Party, already kind of moving into that sort of direction. We want to see more devolved powers given to local councils and for communities to have a real voice to say how things should be taken forward within their local communities. So, you know, there is scope perhaps to look into Citizens' Assembly to see what we can do to take action on climate change. There is, why 2030 or sooner? The targets given by the Conservatives of 2050 would leave us with a 50% chance of risking those catastrophic impacts of climate change happening. And we, as a party, cannot possibly endorse a target that would give us a 50% chance of failure to try and avoid catastrophic climate change. Thank you.
Adrian.
Yeah, to answer the two direct points very straightforwardly, obviously the Liberal Democrats have a target of 2045, and that's in our manifesto and on the sheet here for everyone to see. That doesn't mean to say that we won't try and do things earlier than 2045, but this is the target that we've come up with on the basis of expert advice, discussion at conference, similar to what Sandy mentioned, and debating our own party about where we think it's realistic. We have to be frank and firm. One of the criticisms politicians get is by promising things that don't actually happen. And there's no point in us saying it's going to happen by 2025 when we're quite clearly telling us 2045. So even though the idea of it is laudable, to do as much as you possibly can, as early as we possibly can do it, and I will do everything I could to be able to do that, and we would try and do new electric cars by, say, 2030, so that's one of the objectives, to do it earlier than the carbon neutral status. 2045 is our agreed target, but we will do everything we possibly can to bring that further forward. But then I think we have to be pretty honest with the voters and the constituents about what's reasonable and what's plausible. And though I respect Extinction Rebellion to bring the issue so clearly to everyone in the United Kingdom in various different ways, I think the 2025 target is unrealistic. And that's why we'll do everything to try and get to 2030. But that's a promise. As the Citizens' Assembly, it's a good idea in principle, but again, how are we going to form that? Is that going to be part of a government proposal to go forward? And I think we could then have Citizens' Assemblies on everything, and I think there has to be some kind of discussion about what actually is the prime objective of that assembly, which is why, in theory, it's a good idea, but I want to know more about the structure, how it will be formed, what is it made up of, before we go any further.
Thank you. Before we go any further, can I just double check about the questions I've been given? So is this all the questions, this is some of the questions, or we're going to encourage people to ask them and put their hands up now?
People can. These are representative of the questions that we've received.
Okay. Should we go through these? Should we go through these ones first, and then people can ask other questions?
Yeah, there were some repetitions.
So, okay. So this one here's got 3 times on it. So I presume that this lady Emma Black has not put it in 3 times. 3 different people have put it in. So Emma, would you like to ask a question?
Oh, hello. Yes. I was just obviously going forward. We all need to change our behaviour. One of those things is around on lots of flights. I just wondered how many flights you've taken in the past year or recent years.
Okay, do you want to start this time?
Yes, I can. I have something to admit. Until recently, I have been a very frequent flyer. I've lived in New Zealand for 7 years of my life, and I visited my family nearly every single year. That's not to say that I was ignorant to the impact of climate change. As a coastal ecologist, I was just well and truly believing in myself that what I was doing in terms of my research offset or outweighed the wrong that I was doing through flight. This year I haven't taken any flights. I've used trains, I've used Euro Rail, the student ticket thing, to get across Europe to enjoy my holiday. And that's been a very, very good experience. But yes, I think, you know, we should all definitely do our best to stop using flights and to cut down the amount of air travel that we are doing.
Okay. Adrian,
Yeah, no, I can confess to having 2 flights, one there, one back, and there again. I actually don't like flying, so it's a bit of an easier question for me. I'm not a great flyer, so it's something I struggle with quite a lot, so therefore I don't necessarily have a lot of flying capacity. Saying that though, we all have to think about how we change our behaviours, as the questioner rightly said. And that means travelling in different ways, and if you're going to use, I regularly do go abroad, I regularly use Eurostar. So whether that's to Brussels, to Paris, you know, using Berlin, other ways of getting around the continent without flying. And for me, they're just as quick and as easy to do as flying is not. So for me, it's very clear that people need to change their habits and try and make a individual responsibility to trying to help the climate. And by doing that the best ways possible is, or everyone in this room could do the same. But also we have actually tax reforms in our manifesto, you may notice, to increase costs for frequent flyers and people who are flying every day for business-wise and purposes like that. So there are ways and means of changing your habits and changing the benefits for society.
Yeah, and I think it was about 2002, I made a decision that it was wrong to fly if I could possibly avoid it. And since then, I and my partner have been on holiday to Budapest, to Prague, to Rome 3 times, and Calabria, to Spain, and we've always taken the train every time. I have flown 3 times since 2002, once to, ironically, to a European Environment Conference in Aberdeen, and I remonstrated with the County Council and said to them, look, this is an environment conference, we should be going by train, and they said, no, we can't afford it, and in any case, you won't be able to go, because there was not enough time between the full council meeting and the meeting of the European group in Aberdeen. So that, unfortunately, was one occasion when I had to go. The other 2 occasions were when we already booked a holiday going to Rome, and then SNCF went on strike and we couldn't get there, so we had to fly. And that was a matter of great regret. And the 3rd time was when my father died in Bulgaria, and I had to fly out there to be with my stepmother. But those are the only 3 times I've flown since 2002. I think the answer to flights is, first of all, to massively improve rail infrastructure, because it is ridiculous that people are flying around in the United Kingdom, and I actually think it would be perfectly feasible if we've got good flights, good trains for people to travel to most European destinations by train as well. I went to Amsterdam, Bruges and Amsterdam with my mother by train, and it took us longer to get from Bruges to Amsterdam by train than it did to get back from Amsterdam to St Pancras, because the train from Amsterdam to St Pancras via Brussels is very fast indeed, and the train from Bruges to Amsterdam is very slow indeed.
Good. Thank you for answering that. So we're going to give the next question to Sue Hall. Sue, are you here? Brilliant. Thank you.
I had a question about air pollution, please. I was reading some figures from Healthy Suffolk, and the figures say that there's more than 100 people die in Suffolk every year due to air pollution, and in particular due to particulate air pollution. And they say that car drivers are exposed to twice as much air pollution as pedestrians, and 9 times as much pollution as cyclists. And the cost to the economy nationally is £20 billion in terms of the adverse impact on health. And I just wondered, if you were in a position to do something, what would you do, please?
One of the things we have to do is to change our modes of transport, and that isn't just a one solution at all. And that means A, improving our railways, so we take away cars, B, using buses, 3, getting people cycling, and D, people walking. You know, we've just got to be far more creative, and that will lessen the air pollution that we have in our environment. One of the problems we have is that we consistently end up building motorways, for instance, to get from one place to another, and actually that's not the most efficient or the most air pollutant best way to do that. And therefore, we have to then think of other ways of doing things. Again, it comes back to the question we had previously, not having emissions by flying. We've got to stop having car emissions. Now, for some people that might be difficult to get rid of their cars, but actually, if that's the only way we're going to change society and change the way we live as a society, as a country, then people are going to have to start thinking, well, I can't use my car for short journeys that go into congested towns like Ipswich. People are going to have to use other methods, like walking, like cycling, like having an efficient bus service that runs on time, like having good railways. I use the railways a lot, and I'm sure many of you experience great North Anglia lines on a regular basis, and I'm afraid we all have cancellations on a regular basis. It's not the greatest line. Until we improve those things by actually putting money into infrastructure, that's the only way we're going to change things. But at the same time, hopefully all those things will collate together to reduce air pollution.
Yes, the transport is obviously one of the key ones, and we have got to move over to non-fossil fuel transport as quickly as we possibly can. There's a real issue with some very, very dirty, and you mentioned particulates, which are a particular problem. There's some very, very dirty vehicles out there, and one of the things that I would want to see done very early on in the next government is a tightening of the MOT system and a scrappage scheme to encourage people to move from dirty diesels into non-polluting vehicles, preferably electric vehicles. I think hydrogen has a big part to play in clean vehicles as well, but unfortunately the R&D hasn't got that far yet. But we can and should be moving to non-emitting vehicles within the next 5 years, in my opinion. And if we were to make that commitment, I am quite sure that the manufacturers would be more than happy to do so. Because if we don't move quickly, then we will be left behind, and we will be the dirty people of Europe, as we were in the past. Second thing is incineration. At the moment, there are certain people who seem to think that incineration is the answer to all their problems. It is not. It's marginally better than burying things in the ground, but actually if you burn things, then you are always going to get emissions. We need to be moving towards reducing the amount of waste we create in the first place, reusing things wherever possible, and recycling what is left. Solid fuel heating is a serious problem, and we need to have schemes in place, financial schemes in place to encourage people to move over from solid fuel heating and oil-fired heating, and preferably to solar panels and air-sourced heat pumps. And I was very pleased to go just around the corner where we've got an excellent company doing just that, but they're struggling with the government moving the goalposts and making it more difficult for people to afford those things. And finally, we need to move industry over to electricity, to renewable generated electricity, because unless all our industry is powered by renewable generated electricity, everything that people do at home will be for nothing, because we've got to use renewably generated electricity to run all of our industries, and that requires massive government investment, and the Labour Party is absolutely guaranteeing to put that investment in if we form the next government.
Okay, so air pollution, as you say, 100 people per year in Ipswich, I think was the figure you quoted, is truly shocking, but totally, unfortunately, believable. We have to tackle air pollution both on a local scale, so we need to tackle the sources locally, but we also need to see where it's coming from further afield as well. And by scrapping certain projects, such as Heathrow expansion, would certainly help to prevent further air pollution being brought up from the southwest. And locally, we also need to tackle air pollution, and public transport is certainly at the centre of what we need to do in order to achieve lower air pollution. So we do need to encourage a modal shift away from taking the car and personal transport in general, and more towards walking and cycling. And with our Green New Deal and our housing scheme, we're going to provide strong incentives for people to live within about half a mile from where they work, so that they can walk to work. So we'll have more people walking to work within 2 miles potentially, so that they can cycle. And for people living outside, sort of further afield from work, of course, our public transport is going to be revolutionised. We're going to invest heavily in public transport. For cycleways, £2.5 billion nationwide a year is going to be invested in cycleways to make their place of work accessible by bike. All of this taken together will mean less dependence on cars and personal vehicles. Electric vehicles are being touted as the answer. Yes, but we can't have the same number of electric vehicles as we have petrol engines, because in truth the dust and some of the particulates from the moving parts of vehicles are also part of the problem, and just by changing over to electric vehicles it's not the only solution. Another issue is, although these batteries are becoming more and more efficient, in 10 years' time, do we have a problem disposing a generation of dead car batteries? And there's a lot of things to be resolved. Cars are not really the answer. We need a modal shift towards walking and public transport. So that's it for that.
Okay, very good. I'd like to invite Adam Wybree to bring in the next question.
Yeah, single question. Where do you stand on third runway at Heathrow?
Yes, certainly. Simple answer, I voted against it. And so did the majority of my colleagues, and I'm absolutely honoured. If there were no flights in the United Kingdom, if people actually took the train to destinations within the United Kingdom, we wouldn't need a third runway at Heathrow Airport. And I'm not one of those people who think that it's sensible to allow planes to stack up in the air, but actually we just need to reduce the number of people flying altogether.
I'm resolutely against Heathrow expansion. I really cannot see, in times where we need to be reducing our carbon footprint and making our way to carbon zero by 2030, how having yet another runway at Heathrow is going to help us on the way to that. Indeed, we need to stop advertising for flights, we need to ban advertisements for flights, and we need to place taxes on frequent flyers to make sure that they are de-incentivised from flying, and, as Sandy has said, incentivise rail transport. One of the big problems with convincing people to use the train is that at the moment it's just really, really expensive. And I've experienced that for myself. As somebody on a low income, taking the train is quite a hit. Now, what we would do as the Green Party was we would scrap other schemes like HS2 and pump that money into local rail networks, to improve those networks. We'd have more frequent trains, upgrading our signalling systems, and we would just make it more affordable in general to take the train as opposed to taking a flight or getting into the car.
Yeah, no, it's very, very simple. I've been against third runway at Heathrow for ages. My party has been as well, so I absolutely agree on that one. And we would have a moratorium on all new runways, which is in our party manifesto. And as I mentioned earlier about frequent flyers and taxing, that way bringing more income in if people are, and trying to decentralise them from flying in the first place, will be there. But there's a very simple note on that one.
Thank you. John Taylor, would you like to do the next question?
The north of Ipswich, the Ipswich Garden suburb is set to see 3,500 new homes built. Currently, the developers aren't obliged to fit any renewable energy into that because they argued the council down on that based on viability grounds, even though with falling costs, renewables should technically be 100% feasible in that development. If you and your parties are elected, how would you ensure that all homes, new and old, will be zero carbon as soon as possible?
Yes, well, the first part of that problem is that planning laws are sort of swung in favour of development. They are pro-development. As you know, every council is required to have a 5-year land supply, and that, of course, puts pressure on the councils to sort of allow these 3,500 homes to go up without enforcing measures to make them more sustainable. What we would do if the Green Party got into government is that we would devolve more powers and provide more funding to local councils so that they can ensure that with consultation with the communities that we get the right type of development in the right places, okay, to avoid and minimise the harm as much as possible. We would also make sure that we build nationwide, on a national scale, we would build 100,000 new council homes every year that are truly affordable and truly sustainable. So that means that they meet passive house standards and reduce our bills. So we have a win for both the environment and the economy. These homes will be insulated using sustainable materials such as wood chip and sawdust, and they would be totally powered by renewables.
Yeah. Well, it's firstly to take to the question is it's a disgrace that there is no renewable part of this housing scheme that the council has let through, which is a disgraceful situation. But for the Liberal Democrats, we would ensure that all new homes by 2021, so we're only literally a year or two away from we'll be zero carbon homes. That is our promise in our manifesto. We've got on your list here as well. And we have to also build. We promise to build 300,000 homes a year. 100,000 of those homes are socially rented, socially affordable homes. And obviously the difference of affordable is quite key there, because lots of people use that terminology, but actually what's affordable to one person is not necessarily affordable to somebody else. So they have to fall into a bracket where they are actually affordable for everyone. But it's absolutely key that we invest in making sure that the renewal, those homes that are built, and those homes are built with a complete infrastructure around them. There's no point in building homes and then not having the facilities and the amenities to go with them, which happens quite often, where these ideas are created outside of different towns and cities, and then the hospital facilities or the school facilities or the doctor's surgeries aren't integrated with them. There needs to be a holistic approach to those kind of issues, and therefore bringing them all together is critical. But I'm disappointed to hear that the council, I'm not part of the council here, to not even be including anything in those new 3,500 homes is pretty awful.
Yeah, I actually served on the planning committee of Ipswich Borough Council for a few years, and it is extraordinarily difficult for councillors to actually alter anything that happens, because the whole planning system is weighted in favour of the developers. The developers are determined to minimise their costs and maximise their profits. The way to deal with this actually is, I think, primarily through building regulations rather than through planning law. Because the problem is that if the focus is on planning, then there's always an appeals process. The developers have the right to appeal, but there's no third-party right of appeal. The councillors are always being bamboozled or badgered by their officers to say, well, actually, if you try and go for something that's too good, councillor, then we'll only have an appeal, we'll have to pay the legal costs, blah, blah, blah. If it's set in building regulations, then there is no way out. I think one of the most despicable things that the Conservative government has done on building regulations in recent times is actually water them down and take the responsibility for monitoring them away from councils as well, so that over and over again developers have actually put in spurious building regulation commitments and then not kept to them. So we need to have enforceable building regulations, and we need to make the maximum level of insulation and renewable energy input and grey water use and everything else built into those homes. And I agree with Adrian, it's not just about the buildings, it's also about making sure that they've got a new estate, it's got cycleways, that it's got bus routes, that it's got everything that you need to maximise the sustainability of that development. And the North Ipswich development, unfortunately, is not a council development, so it's incredibly difficult to stop the developers from doing what they want to do.
Joe Stokes has written a question.
My question is about Labour, and I don't mean the party, I mean the people. You all three here represent parties who are advocating very admirably huge increases in activity in various different places. The Labour Party wants to reduce class sizes to 30, so we need lots more teachers and teacher assistants. Obviously, the National Health, we need huge numbers of extra people. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're all talking about more input for police and support in jails. And the biggest of the whole lot, probably, well, there's various infrastructure projects like tidal power and wind power, but the biggest, probably, one of the whole lot is house building, and particularly insulating these houses on the time scale you are all talking about. And you've got to train all these people, which is going to take more input, and I'm at a loss to understand where these people are going to come from. Our unemployment rate in this country is very low, and probably a lot of people who are not lucky enough to be employed wouldn't be appropriate. So what does that leave you with? Unless I'm missing something, you either have to dramatically increase the number of immigrants, and I'd like to know if any of you plan to do that. And finally, the only other thing I can think of is that you poach people from different industries, and if you're planning to do that, which are the industries? The obvious one, if you wish to be green, is to cut back on road transport schemes. So you've all had plenty of time to think about all this. So do you have specific road transport schemes, the major ones obviously, that you wish to cut back on, and if so, which ones? And to get a bit more topical locally, what about the Northern Bypass?
It's my turn. Okay, I shall try and sum that interesting question all up into one part. Let's just take the Northern Bypass first very quickly. There is a proposal for it. It has not gone through. There are lots of issues with it from an environmental perspective. That's why it's not happened. That's why I know my local county and borough councillors have spoken against it, and have been very open and clear with me about their concerns around it. But when you talk about labour forces making sure that we can do all these things that we say we will be able to do, I think it's very fair to say that you then have to look at our manifesto's cost of profit. And my only answer I can give to you there is very clearly that the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the IFS, have very clearly come out to say the Liberal Democrat manifesto, out of all the three main parties, is the most efficient, most effective, most plausible, and most cost of profit. So therefore, all the things that we have promised to do, whether that's building homes, whether that's infrastructure, whether that's 11 billion to mental health services, all the different things, that has been seen as a credible, plausible manifesto. The other two parties have both had major criticism on both their manifestos that the figures don't add up. You can ask Sandy on that one and see what answer he comes up with. But at the same time, there are lots of those issues that you related there that you are implying in some way that there should be a restriction to it. And for me, as a Liberal Democrat and as a pro-European, we shouldn't have any restrictions on immigration. I'm very clear about that. Immigration has brought diversity and business to this country. It's something that we should applaud and enjoy and value. And if we weren't in the situation that we have beginning with B, then we would then have, we wouldn't be losing 10,000 nurses who've already left the United Kingdom to go back to their European countries. So we are unfortunately in a position where we are losing people who would be doing some of those jobs already. And that's my biggest concern. So for me, bringing people to this country is a benefit. It brings business and will fill some of those jobs that you're looking for people to do.
Adrian, I haven't interrupted so far, but can I just ask, because you did say that your councillors were not in favour of the Northern Bypass, but I don't think you said what your personal position was on this.
Yes, I follow the same position as them, because I obviously respect what they have told me and how they feel about it. And I am quite openly, I don't live in Ipswich, and I'm going to be very open and honest about that, so therefore I have to listen to their concerns and what they feel about it. So that's why I mentioned it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there was a very large construction programme in this country going on until 2006, and then suddenly all ground to a halt. And thousands of skilled construction workers, not just builders, but electricians, plumbers, all the rest of it, were thrown out of work in 2008. And I think if you talk to UCAT, the Construction Workers Trade Union, they'll tell you there's still an awful lot of people who have construction skills who are doing much less responsible and less well-paid jobs elsewhere, simply because there is still less work than we have skilled workers to do it. So there is a capacity there to increase the number of people working in construction, and I'm quite sure that most of the people are needed for a big expansion in house building and the other investment in construction work that we need to do will be forthcoming. Secondly, we need to massively increase training. We need to make sure that young people are not being left in huge amounts of debt when they're trying to train to do the jobs that we need them to do. And construction work is obviously one of those areas where we need far more people being trained in this country. We need to have a level playing field of respect between university and other forms of training, and we need to make sure that we're properly funding other forms of training as well, which at the moment we're not doing, and we need to be supporting those people through their training so that they don't give up halfway and go and stack shelves at Sainsbury's or Tesco's or wherever. The third thing is that on a temporary basis, I'm sure most people in this room probably remember our Hyyrylainen-Trett. Those were people who went to work in a wealthier country in construction because there was a shortage of construction workers in that country. And then when they'd finished their contracts, they came back to the country they came from. And I think we've already got a situation where quite a lot of Polish construction workers are going back to Poland. I have got absolutely no problem with people coming to do specific construction work in this country, and I think you will probably find that after a period of time, quite a lot of them will want to go back to the country where they grew up, a country where they speak the native language, and a country which probably has grown economically in the time that they've been away as well. Because one of the things that we forget is that a lot of the Eastern Europeans who came to this country at a time when their countries were poor are now thinking, well, actually my country's quite a nice country to go back to, I'll go back. So I've got no problem with them coming here, and as a temporary measure, while we're training people in this country, I think that's excellent. You asked specifically about the Northern Bypass, and so I will just say that we need to do everything. It's not good enough just to do one thing and not another thing. I don't think that a Northern Bypass, which might or might not start construction in 8 or 9 years' time, is going to stand in the way of us doing all the other things that we need to do in the meantime. And I will continue to argue, and I know most people in this room wouldn't necessarily agree with me about this, but I will continue to argue for something that will take congestion out of Ipswich, and if and when it is built, it will not be primarily with fossil fuel powered vehicles, because if in 8 or 9 years' time we haven't moved over to non-fossil fuel emitting vehicles, then we're stuck anyway. So we need to make sure that we are doing all the things that we need to do in order to avoid the climate crisis. And I certainly don't think that saying we can't do this because we've got to do that is a sensible way forward on anything.
Sorry, not to interrupt.
Can I just point out that the emissions of the cars on the road is not the only issue with the road. Making a road releases certain emissions, and it does destroy a patch of countryside. So I just ask you to consider that impact of the road as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, this whole meeting could degenerate into an argument about the Northern Bypass. I think we have got a massive, massive issue on our plate with dealing with the climate crisis. I've said what I think about the Northern Bypass, and you may very well disagree with it, but let's move on, please, because otherwise we might just as well just have a debate about the Northern Bypass and nothing else.
Okay, so to come to your first part of the question, Sandy has alluded to the government chopping and changing its training programmes, and this has led to a shortage of skills that we would need in order for our tradesmen to carry out jobs of insulation and perhaps the jobs of managing our land sustainably, or sort of operating and managing renewables. So the Green Party is going to commit a large amount of spending in order to make sure that we are training people to do these jobs that we are going to create for the future. We're going to radically reform the way that we generate our energy. We want 70% of that energy to come from wind farms. We will encourage local energy generation, but we will also be relying on large-scale operations as well. And of course, we will need the workforce to maintain and operate that, and that's what we're going to put funding into to make sure that can be done. We're not going to close our borders. The Green Party is firmly about opening up to the world. It's a party of compassion, and we want to welcome immigrants into our country and to bring skills into roles such as nursing in the NHS, for example, which is something you alluded to there. Let's just, I could say a lot about the skills shortages and what we need, but let's just move quickly to the Ipswich Northern Bypass. Now, the Green Party is the only party that is 100% and united against building the Ipswich Northern Bypass. As you'll see, Dan Poulter has become more or less the poster boy for the Stop the Ipswich Northern Route campaign, and which is a pity because he is at odds with his party, who will continue to support large road building schemes, and they do support the building of the Ipswich Northern Route. They were the ones that proposed the consultation, and whilst many Tories have sort of backed down a little bit, at least I've heard through the grapevine, many of them still openly advocate it. I have tried as a councillor to hold the Conservative-led district council in mid-Suffolk. I've tried to hold their feet to the fire. They declared a climate emergency, and they agreed with the Green Party's bill or motion for a biodiversity emergency as well. Yet at the same time, they are the ones that are supporting the Ipswich Northern Route. I've asked them to consider or to reconsider their position on the Northern Route in light of the climate and biodiversity emergency, and they keep putting the questions off time after time after time. Of course, we need to acknowledge that this is not just about climate change. It's also about biodiversity, it's about the tranquility of our countryside and the values that we place on living in Suffolk.
Does anyone have a Silver Scola OBE licence plate? I don't know if that's anyone here, or it could be the class downstairs. What's going on? Because apparently it's blocking people getting out. So the people who are also in the hall say they can't be. Okay, if I can check downstairs.
Yeah, Tony Horner, do you want to ask the next question, please?
Yeah, thank you. I've got to follow the script. All of you claim to agree that climate change is an urgent priority. And we have one party not present today who clearly doesn't think this is the case. Yet you're all standing against each other. Which may result in the Conservative Party being elected, which will put back the cause of climate change by at least 5 super critical years, the most important 5 years. Even at this late stage, you could join together and put the cause before party politics. Every vote counts in Ipswich. How would you feel about letting in a Conservative government together with a contempt for urgent climate change action?
Well, thank you very much for that question. At the last general election, I was elected with a majority of 831 votes, which is less than 1% of the electorate. Between myself and the Conservative candidate, Ben Gummer, we got 93% of the vote. Being realistic about this, there are only 2 candidates who can possibly win the election here this time. At the moment, our polls indicate that Tom Hunt, who has not ever sounded at all enthusiastic about doing anything about the climate crisis, is around 1% ahead of me. That is within the margin of error, but it's scary nonetheless. I am very hopeful that there are people who voted Conservative last time who are so disgusted with the way that some of the this election is being generated and the consequences of some of the actions that the Conservatives are putting forward, that they may very well not vote Conservative this time. And there are some who would not ever be able to bring themselves to vote Labour, and if those people decided to vote Liberal, Democrat or Green instead, then I've not got a problem with that. But anybody who really does not want Tom Hunt as a Conservative to be elected as Member of Parliament in this constituency does need to vote for me, because I am the only person who can stop him, and at the moment it looks quite likely that I won't.
We've got James here.
For those of you who don't know, just a reminder that we did invite people from 2 constituencies to this event, which means 2 Liberal Democrats very kindly agreed to come. Unfortunately, no Conservatives have agreed to come, and only 1 representative from the Party, the Green Party. So I'm pleased they're both here. What we had proposed before was that perhaps they would have the opportunity to take it in turns or something, rather than 2 answers for the same thing.
I'll do that question and then we'll switch it.
Is that okay? I think actually it's probably
okay. Yes, well, I really do feel sympathetic to that request in many sort of ways, because I do also feel that there is an argument to unite to stop the Tories from getting in, who yes don't have any or have much sympathies for those who have concerns about climate change and don't have very ambitious targets in order to address it. First, can I just point out that the Lib Dems and the Greens have been making pacts across the country called the Unite to Remain Pact. The Green Party have stood down in Chelmsford to give the Lib Dem candidate a clear run, and the Lib Dems have stood down for our parliamentary candidate for Bury, Helen Geek, to give her a clear run against Joe Churchill. So there are circumstances where we can unite and sort of strategise a little bit. Now, some of you might think, well, that's not the idea of democracy, but it is, I think it is a good way to try and prevent Tories from gaining those seats. I have to say, unless you can prove me otherwise, Sandy, that Labour has decided it won't be standing down in any seats in order to give the other candidates a clear shot during this election.
Can I just quickly answer that? You're absolutely right. Because it's a Democratic Party, it would be extremely difficult for us to do that. We would have to have a conference resolution. Otherwise, somebody could say, well, I'm going to stand as a Labour candidate then. So it would need to be done.
Right.
The alternative, and the alternative that I'm absolutely focused on as the Vice Chair of the Labour campaign for electoral reform, is to have a proportional system so that every person's vote can count, irrespective of We're pledged to have a constitutional convention. I will do my damnedest to ensure that proportional representation is agreed at that.
You've stolen my fire there, Sam.
Sorry.
I was about to mention the fact that our democratic system is totally not fit for purpose in the 21st century, and we do need first past the post system, and that is in our manifesto under our transforming democracy section. You can read it in there. In your time, so we do need first past the post. This would eliminate the problem that we have. We need, proportional representation to make sure that we eliminate the problem that we face here, where you feel that in central Ipswich a vote for Green or Lib Dem would be a wasted vote. What I can just say in the constituency where I'm standing against Dan Poulter is that his margin is so big at the moment. I think that between the Lib Dems, Greens and Labour, there could be a swing in any direction. There doesn't seem to be a majority for, or like a really tangible kind of vote to keep the Tories out in that part. So I think in Central Suffolk you can vote with your heart.
What about Ipswich, though?
Ipswich, well, I'm not going to answer that question. Sorry.
Okay, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll answer this one because I know it's probably going to be the question that people's answers, people's views are wanting to hear what I think about this. Now, look, let's be very honest. If there had been an agreement between Labour and Liberal Democrat leaderships, and I'm not going to put blame on either side, then we could have had this. We could have had candidates representing to stay and to remain in the European Union. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And that's not my fault, and that's not Sandy's fault. At the same time, you mentioned PR, and I know you are the Vice Chair of PR campaign of the Labour Party, but it isn't in your manifesto. So for me, there is a personal campaign for it, but your party nationally doesn't support it because it's not in the manifesto. And therefore, for me, it's politically right that everybody has the option to choose whichever party they want to vote for. And you need to have a range of parties. And therefore that's the reason why I haven't stood down, and I'm not going to. Because I have been asked in a number of emails today, will I do so, and I'm not going to. Because though I had a very small percentage in 2017, and it was 2.3% for those of you who like statistics, so I accept I've got probably no chance of winning. In the European elections in 2019, the Liberal Democrats beat the Labour Party in this constituency. So there were 5,600 votes to 5,000. So on that basis, that is the most recent voting election in this constituency, and that is the reason why I will stand as a Liberal Democrat candidate in Ipswich.
Okay. Right, so Tina Smith, do you want to answer the next question, please?
The recent UN IPCC Climate Change and Land Use report says we must move away from eating meat and dairy to stop global warming reaching a dangerous level. Animal agriculture is responsible for around 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and cutting out meat and dairy can reduce your carbon footprint by up to 73%. What will you do to help this country transition to a sustainable plant-based food system?
Yeah, sure. So I totally agree personally with the fact that we do need to move away from eating meat and dairy, and in particular, you know, to sort of become vegetarian seems pretty straightforward to a lot of people. perhaps going vegan might be a little bit of a hard sell to everybody. It's just one of those things. It's our culture at the moment, unfortunately, and that is the thing that we need to try and to sort of progressively change, perhaps. The Green Party's stance is that most of our food should come from plant-based sources, and we advocate what's known as the healthy planet, healthy diet, which would basically mean that you could have an allowance of 1 egg per week. You could have a couple of small fish, perhaps, and the equivalent to 1 beef patty. I personally don't think that really goes far enough. I think that, you know, it should be a little bit more restricted than that, but that's just my opinion. What we really need to do, and what we will do, is make it more affordable for people to eat good, wholesome, nutritious food and more vegetables, and we would make it more expensive to eat meats, especially meat that's been farmed unsustainably, and the carbon tax that we're going to introduce is going to be one way of ensuring that, because compared to plant-based foods, animal-based foods are very, very carbon intensive, and we all know that. So this carbon tax is going to hit the dairy and meat producers harder than those who are farming vegetables and cereal crops for human consumption. And there would be then incentives, because a lot of that cost will be passed on to the person buying the food. There will be incentives to make healthier choices for themselves and healthier choices for the planet. And I just want to highlight what I feel is the real seriousness of animal-based foods. I'm not perfect myself, I'm not preaching, but the fires in the Amazon rainforest that have been encouraged by the fascist Brazilian president Jair Bolsonaro recently, you know, to increase soya and corn production, it does end up in our food systems. That is feeding our cattle, and we honestly need to stop. We need to stop this because there is a double carbon emission there. We're destroying the rainforests, and we're also creating greenhouse emissions through the cattle. Of course, you can argue that there are more sustainable ways of producing meat, and organically produced meat on pasture-fed grass. And if we are going to treat ourselves to a steak now and then, we need to ensure that that meat has come from a sustainably sourced background.
Well, we're speaking on a personal level. I do recognise there is a moral question about whether rearing animals simply for the sake of us eating them is a moral thing to do, and I've come to the conclusion it isn't. I think in terms of our politics, it's going to be one of those issues that I think it's going to be there's going to need to be a long-term change on this in terms of how we think about this. If you look back, I'm going to take an analogy to say, if you look back 200 years, people didn't think that slavery was kind of morally unacceptable. But it became, over time, something that was actually recognised as being morally unacceptable. And I think it's going to be that level of sort of change, gradual change over time that's needed. And I need to well, I'm not going to say it's a hypocrite because I'm not actually a vegetarian, but I've come to recognise actually that there is been a moral question about how I live my life, because it is not actually morally acceptable simply to raise animals for the sake of eating them. Now, in terms of our farming economy as it is now, if we want to encourage vegetable farming in Suffolk, I mean, so much of our farming economy does rely on a lot of migrant labour. So I'll just make the point that we are potentially facing a problem with that due to Brexit, and we definitely, with certainly our policies that don't happen, we want to encourage and nurture sustainable farming methods?
Yeah, I became a vegetarian in 1981, and that was primarily on ethical grounds. But it was also partly because of the environmental impact as well. I don't eat very much dairy. I don't use very much milk, and when I do, it's usually soy milk, and I usually use an olive spread as a spread. But I do occasionally have cheese. I think it would be quite difficult for me to give it up. And my main problem with giving up the last vestiges of dairy is that I have an absolutely fantastic 26-year-long, nearly 27-year-long relationship with my partner. I don't want to jeopardise that for the sake of being an absolutist on this. If we're going to achieve what we absolutely have to achieve over the very short period of time that we've got left, we are going to have to build a consensus across this country about what we're going to do. And I think if we start out by saying we're going to ban all meat and dairy, then I don't think we'll achieve that. But there are things that we can do straight away. And the first thing we can do is we can reduce the outrageous amount of food waste that we've got in this country. The second thing we can do is that we can really, really promote healthy eating, which will basically mean more fruit and vegetables and less meat and dairy. And the third thing, we can make sure that the meat and dairy agriculture that we do have is done in a much more organic way, that we reduce the carbon impact of animal feeds, that our trade in foodstuffs across the world is far more environmentally based, and that we have basic environmental safeguards for trade, and that doesn't just go for foodstuffs, but my goodness, it does go for foodstuffs. I mean, in particular, obviously palm oil, but also animal feeds. There are all sorts of things that we are importing into this country which are trashing other parts of the world. And there's no point actually in saving the planet just in this country if we're trashing the planet and the rest of the world. So, I mean, there are things that we need to do straight away. I think banning meat and dairy is not one of them, but we do need to encourage people to eat less meat and dairy, certainly.
Bring washing and books.
Okay. Now, the last question I've got on a card here is from Helen. Do you want to do that one, Helen? And then we've got a bit of time before 8:30 cut-off. So if you've got further questions, if you can think about them now and raise your hands, and we'll try and get through a few extra questions in the remaining time.
XR's 3 demands bill includes XR's 3 demands, that's Extinction Rebellion's 3 demands, and calls on government to set a target date of 31st of December 2025 to reach zero greenhouse gas emissions, and for a citizens' assembly to be initiated to determine the wide-ranging policy changes needed to reach this target. Do you support this bill, and will you sign it?
Do you want to answer that one? Yeah.
I've obviously had a copy of this for a little while. I've had a good read of it. The intentions are all in the right direction, but they don't fulfil our manifesto, and therefore I'm very clear that I couldn't sign this at this point in time. That doesn't mean to say that the objectives within it are not without foundation and we can work towards them, but at this current moment in time I can sign it.
James, do you want to have your opportunity?
Well, I've looked at the bill and like Adrian, I think it's got good intentions, but I think actually the bill itself is slightly framed in the wrong way. If you look, I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I can talk about legislation, but what it does is it puts lots and lots of duties on the Prime Minister, and obviously there's been a precedent with the Ben bill that you want the Prime Minister doing something very specific, but I think actually this bill would be better if it's framed across government and has some wider duties and obligations. And one policy I like best on my manifesto is that we actually want to introduce a general duty of care to the environment that applies to every single company in this country. So I think there's a better bill that I'd like to introduce on this.
Yes, I mean, as I said at the outset, we actually put forward a climate emergency motion to Parliament on the 1st of May, and that really pretty much covers point A here. And actually it's got quite a lot of the other things that are in this bill in that motion which we passed, because as I said, the Conservatives decided not to risk voting on it at all. I'm very happy with most of what's in this bill, and I think it's all the intentions there are right. If we were doing it through Parliament, which obviously if it came up forward as a bill it would, then what would happen is it would come forward for a second reading. And the second reading is where you vote on something in principle, and then you take it to committee and look at it in detail and try and make it better, or make it more feasible, or make it actually effective. And my guess is, and my hope is, that I would be able to vote for it on second reading and then make some amendments. But I do think that the 2025 target date is unrealistic. And I think I can understand why people would want to achieve. I would desperately want to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2025. But I think it is so unachievable that it would actually undermine our ability to achieve it by 2030 if we tried to set it by 2025. So on those grounds, I don't think I can actually sign the bill as it stands as a publicity thing. But I would really, really like to be, I would like to be one of the sponsors for this bill, or a bill very similar to it if it didn't have a 2025 date in it. If I was elected, I would dearly love to be one of the sponsors for it, to bring it forward to Parliament. Because as I said, having a motion isn't effective enough. It needs to be a bill.
Right. Yeah, I would like to thank you sincerely for putting this bill across. And if we were in power, we certainly would bring a bill like this to Parliament. Let me just say that I don't want to reiterate too much why we have 2030 as our target, but it is what we feel is realistic, and we feel is the target we need to achieve in order to avoid the catastrophic climate change that would come with a more than 1.5 degree rise post pre-industrial levels. So 2030 needs to be the target, and we do need to get over this can't-do attitude. We do just need to get roll up our sleeves and be prepared to get our our hands dirty in order to sort of bring these policies forward to reach that target. And the Greens do have a path to that. I can't speak on behalf of the Green Party leaders, but I would really beg you to send this bill to them so that they can review it themselves. And can't wholeheartedly agree with 2025, although it would be a good target on the way to the 2030 goal. With regards to the duties placed on the Secretary of State, well, the Green Party has ambitions to open up a new government department that is wholeheartedly and just solely committed to bringing us to that goal of the net zero carbon economy by 2030. And we would have a carbon chancellor who would move into number 11 Downing Street to bring everything together in government, okay, and make sure that happens. It's going to be the responsibility of that carbon chancellor to do that. With the Citizens' Assembly, we love the idea. The Green Party is a champion of bringing voices to the community, giving communities voices. Something that has been referred to as localism, but actually is really devolution of powers to local governments, local councils, district councils, and also to make sure that the funds and the money is provided so that local communities can be consulted and that their voice actually has weighting in decisions. And I can give you an example. On the East Coast, we have the so-called Suffolk Suffolk Coast Power, or something like this. Sorry, I'm jumbling my words. But basically, there are arguments as to whether we should have Sizewell C. We're totally against Sizewell C, of course, because we're anti-nuclear. But there is also contention around developing wind power. Of course, the Green Party is going to need some big wind power infrastructure to meet that target of 70% energy from wind farms in order to achieve our goal of 2030. However, that will not come without local impacts to biodiversity and will come at a carbon cost in order to get the infrastructure there and set up. So what we need is devolved powers to local governments and to communities to decide on site locations and the means in which we're going to get these things constructed and get renewables going. So we think that local people are the ones that understand best and would have the right ideas of where to put infrastructure. So in a way that is, and we've also supported citizens' assemblies in Northern Ireland. So whilst I cannot speak for the party at large, I don't see any reason as to why we wouldn't have something like this in place when we want to consult with the public on climate change. We have a good blueprint for tackling climate change, but we don't have all the solutions. Some of those solutions need to come from the people.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you're the first to put up your hand.
Joan Hardingham. Christmas is a good time when our grotesque overconsumption is visible in every shop in every city. What bar humbug regulations would you put in place to try and stop plastic Christmas trees and baubles and the ultimate in one-use plastic?
I've been working on this quite a lot in my role as Shadow Minister for Waste Recycling. In my view, there are various things that we need to do, but first thing we need to do is we need to place the responsibility for dealing with the waste firmly on the producers, because so long as the producers don't have any financial responsibility for what happens to the stuff once people have decided to throw it away, they will produce any amount of tat, and it's not going to be any problem for them. The second thing we desperately need to do is we actually need to have more environmental education in schools. People need to not feel the need for buying plastic tat, quite honestly. And the third thing I would say is that I think we need a change in philosophy. It's not just about specific items, it's not just about plastic, it's about the whole way in which we think about ourselves. We need to move towards a post-consumerist world, because we are all, well, barring a very small number of people in this country, comfortably off. There are only a small number of people who do not have enough to live on, absolutely. Now, I personally believe that we ought to be able to enjoy ourselves, and I enjoy quite a lot of things, but they don't need to involve consumption. They don't need to involve consuming stuff. And if we can get through to people at an early age, if we can change the feel of society so that people actually measure their happiness by things that they're doing together, rather than by what they can buy, then I think we will move a long way in that direction as well.
Yeah, I have to concur exactly with what Sandy is saying there, is that you know, we do need to change the culture of consumerism in our country totally, and that kind of goes right from, you know, the advertisements for these things on the television, right up to holding the manufacturers accountable. And one thing that our carbon tax would do would be to make sure that companies don't just mindlessly produce this tat, and that there would be, because there would be less there would be less of an incentive to do so. There would be less profit from it. We would also impose on companies that they make sure that all whiteware and these sorts of household goods have a 10-year warranty, because what this then does is ensure that anything that we buy is quite easily repairable, because it would give them an incentive to make sure that items are repairable and replaceable, or the parts of those items are. Therefore, sort of helping our industry to build a circular economy where everything can be recycled or upcycled. And one thing, so back to Christmas, I would personally sort of recommend that, you know, if you do feel under pressure to buy an expensive present for a loved one, you have to question question the values a little bit perhaps, but you know, I think people should be just really happy to spend quality time with family and friends, and to receive something, a gift that's just comes from the heart and is well thought out, and that you could support charity shops, you could support fair trade, you could support organic, maybe buy something that people need, like a plastic-free razor, for example, or maybe a fair phone that is basically every bit is totally anyway. Research it yourself, but yeah, I would just say, okay, if you're going to consume and buy Christmas presents, make sure, just do it wisely.
Yeah, I've finished off very. I mean, it's taking Christmas as the subject you've actually raised. Packaging around Christmas presents. We all know how much stuff within Christmas presents. There is a waste of plastic and waste of packaging. That's something you can look at with what you decide to buy for people. Try and get something that isn't including all that kind of stuff within the present. But for the Liberal Democrats, we would ban single-use plastic by 2023 and aim to ban plastic waste export by 2030. And we've all seen the Attenborough films of the oceans, the plastic in the oceans that's accumulated, animals dying, biodiversity being lost. We all know those effects are there. We've got to do something about it ourselves, and this is what comes back to the changing society, individuals taking responsibility for their lives and making society better. And one of those things is to make sure we have less plastic. It's very simple.
Do you want to have an opportunity to answer this one?
Just also think there's opportunities to move away in terms of marketing potentially from a white Christmas to a green Christmas, and if we think about green Christmas does work on basically this kind of marketing path, and marketing is a good way of changing behaviour. It's actually, if we got green marketing around Christmas, we could actually change some behaviours.
So this is the time in question time where normally they have a planned, very quick question where you've got 30 seconds to answer the question. So has anybody got a very quick question that can be answered in 30 seconds each? So this gentleman has his hand
not
first.
the question I originally wanted to ask, and I know Sandy Martin doesn't want to talk about Ipswich Northern Bypass anymore, but I've been empowered by lots of people to find out what, as a constituency of North Ipswich and Central Suffolk, what does James think about Ipswich Northern Bypass? And I don't know if Emma Bonner happens to agree with Sandy or not. Personally, I know a lot of people in Ipswich who would vote tactically if Sandy changed his mind on the Northern Bypass, and that would be his 1%. But specifically, what's your view?
There was a question earlier about whether the candidates supported.
I think
it's more complicated than just that, but
yeah. Can I just say, I think road building is very symptomatic of people denying or not fully understanding or avoiding the multifaceted issues relating to climate change.
Okay, should we ask the specific question?
No, I'm very much against the Northern Bypass.
You are?
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think there are other ways of, there is a problem of traffic coming into Ipswich from the north, and I think there could be better ways of managing that. We need more parking rides outside Ipswich as well, so I think other solutions.
Do you know about your colleague Sam?
No.
Okay. Mark, did you have a very quick one?
Could you say, could we reintroduce these Second World War posters that were all over Britain and put them all over Britain again in public places? Would you like to hold them up?
Make your amend. Is your journey really necessary? And dig for victory. Can I just say, I was over at the Emmaus this morning, and they are doing a fantastic job there, preparing clothes for reuse. And I must admit, I'm not wearing any reused clothes here, but I do have reused clothes at home. And I think the allotments campaign is a really, really good one as well. And people, it's not just getting healthy, organically grown vegetables, but you actually make yourself healthier in doing the digging as well.
Pesticide free.
Yeah.
Okay. the candidates happy to have one more question, and I think this really should be the very last question.
It's a very quick one.
Okay.
I was just a bit confused, Sandy, a little bit earlier, and I may have misheard, but you spoke about net zero by 2030, but it says 2040 on your sheet of paper.
On which sheet? Right, okay, well, I conveniently have the manifesto here. If I can find the right page. So, I mean, we're aiming, what we're saying is, we're not absolutely confident of achieving 2030, but we're going to do our damnedest to get there. And that was a commitment that we made at the debate in conference. So it is actually, it's sort of baked in because it is something that is supported by the membership of the party. But let's see what it says. Right, here we are. So right at the start of this section, the intergovernmental plan of climate change said we need to cut global emissions in half by 2030. But obviously, we need to do better than that in this country because we're actually in a better position to do. Our Green New Deal aims to achieve the substantial majority of our emissions reductions by 2030. And we will do everything we can to achieve as much as we possibly can by 2030. I think that constitutes a target of 2030. No, I'm not sure what that means.
I think it means not in the air. If that's not part of
Okay. So I'm very grateful to the candidates for coming today to give their time to answer your questions. I'm very grateful that all of you have come here today to engage in the process of the election and to give your views on and hear their views. So can we conclude the evening by giving everybody a round of applause? Thank you.